Welcome everyone to our first recorded lecture. Hopefully this is not too boring for you guys, but anyway, it's exciting stuff to talk about. If you remember, last class we left off talking about how the immediate aftermath of the Second World War had left much of Europe and Asia in pretty rough shape. And also, we saw the beginning of the breakdown of this wartime alliance between the Soviet Union and the United States, and a growing sense of mistrust on the part of both sides towards each other. And so today we're going to look at how that mistrust grows into outright antagonism and the development of this kind of standoff between the two superpowers that we usually call the Cold War. So the key questions for today are: how did the wartime alliance break down and lead to the beginning of the Cold War? How did the ways of life established in East and West Europe compare with one another? And how did the defensive strategies of the Cold War make nuclear war mankind's biggest threat, but also, somewhat ironically, the greatest source of security? So like I said, in last class, we saw that a lot of people had kind of clung to this hope that the wartime alliance between the Soviets and the United States and its allies would continue into the post-war period. But within just months of the end of the conflict, it became fairly clear that mistrust and fear on both sides was shaping policy and shaping the approach much more quickly. And it's going to lead to a series of decisions and a series of stances that are going to result in an armed standoff between these two sides that we call the Cold War. Now, the antipathy that the West felt towards communism, as we have already seen in this class, stretched back decades. And the Soviets, for their part, had developed an ideology that saw Western, quote-unquote, imperialists as the enemy. So the fact that these mutual antipathies existed and were reinforced by these differing cultural and economic systems that the two sides had, capitalism and communism, made this kind of worsening of relations almost inevitable. And even worse, the United States and the Soviet Union both had ideologies which claimed to hold out hope for the future of mankind. Because of this, competition between them was to be much more than just a military or economic confrontation. It was to be a competition between different ways of life. Now, the reasons for the Cold War are many and very complex, but when this new struggle emerged at the end of the 1940s, it draped the world in a sense of impending gloom. It seemed as if the Third World War was just around the corner, and fairly small regional conflicts like the Korean War soon took on dimensions of being a struggle to the death between these forces of communism and capitalism. Now, Albert Einstein once remarked that, quote, "I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." Now, what he meant by that was that an actual confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union would have resulted in the absolute and total destruction of human civilization. And this was because after the first few years of the Cold War, both sides were armed with nuclear weapons. Ironically, however, it was this means of total human annihilation that perhaps saved humanity from the ravages of another war. Nonetheless, the period of the Cold War saw humanity living under a pretty dark cloud. So that's what we're going to look at the beginnings of today. If we go back to this period where we left off last class, the Cold War actually begins fairly incrementally. And as such, it doesn't really have a definitive starting point. There's not one day or one date that you can really ascribe the beginning of the Cold War to. It kind of gradually emerges after World War II. While there were many potential points of disagreement between the Soviet Union and the United States around the world, it's actually going to be Germany that's going to be the heart of this tension. Remember, Germany's divided up into these different zones of occupation, and all the major decisions are supposed to be made collectively by all of these different forces, the Soviets, the United States, the British, the French. This leads to a lot of opportunities for disagreement. But it's not just Germany. All of Europe is another point of tension because all of Europe is in pretty big trouble. The misery of the people of Germany, France, Belgium, all these places, were suffering from food shortages, fuel shortages, all sorts of things, and it made the appeal of the communists increase. Now, the Soviets did very little to ease the fears of the West, and some commentators began to speak of the fact that the Soviets were simply waiting for Europe to kind of fall into their hands. Now, this worry, this concern, and the increasing kind of uncooperativeness of the Soviets led the U.S. Secretary of State, George Marshall, and his staff to devise a plan that they hoped would actually jumpstart the European economy and provide a pathway to hope for the people of Western Europe. Now, this project began to take form as the European Recovery Programs, usually known as the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was announced in 1947 after Marshall had actually toured Europe and seen how miserable everybody was. And what it was it was supposed to be a massive infusion of American money. It was going to be basically very low interest, cheap loans and grants to Europe that they could use to jumpstart their economic recovery and to get Europeans to invest in their own economies. Many Europeans had kind of held back on reinvesting and rebuilding because they were unsure of the political situation. So this kind of plan was not only just going to give Europeans money, but it also favored programs that European countries put together that required them to cooperate with one another. So if Belgium and the Netherlands and France presented a plan that they wanted to rebuild a certain railroad line or something like that together, collectively, the United States would give them more money. Now, the point behind this was to encourage not just economic recovery, but to encourage European countries to put kind of the competition of the past behind them and to move towards a cooperative future. Now, interestingly, this approach meant that different European countries had to give the United States a bunch of economic data, a bunch of facts about their economy, how their economy worked, what kind of assets they had, and all sorts of things. Well, most Western European countries had no problem with this. But when the plan was actually offered to the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union's new satellite states in Eastern Europe, this was obviously viewed very suspiciously by the communists. They didn't want to give the United States all of this economic data that the United States wanted in exchange for its money. And they saw this as an attempt by the United States to kind of implant capitalism throughout Europe. So the Soviets rejected the Marshall Plan and forced their satellite states to do the same, to reject it as well. And as you can see from this poster here, it's a propaganda poster made in the Soviet Union. You can see Uncle Sam being portrayed as this kind of suspicious and devious figure here, and this document that he holds in his hand is the Marshall Plan, but you can see the Marshall Plan is hiding underneath it a rifle with a bayonet on it. And so in essence, what this poster is saying is that the Marshall Plan looks nice and he's offering eggs and food and things like that, but in reality what Uncle Sam wants is he wants to dominate the world, right? Now, obviously, such rhetoric is going to worsen relations, and it does. This downward kind of trajectory in the relationship gets even worse when the communists throughout Eastern Europe ignore the democratic elections that they were supposed to hold after the war. Soviet officers and special police officers and things like that help local communists in Poland and in Hungary and other places to basically seize control of these countries while ignoring their promise for democratic elections. And when the same thing starts to happen in the eastern part of Germany that the Soviets control, when the Soviets put German communists in charge of everything in their zone of occupation, the Americans and British and French begin to worry that if they ever reunify Germany, as they're supposed to, the Soviets will take over the entire country. Now, this kind of left Germany in limbo, and its future was undecided. And this prevented the German economy from getting off the ground, from recovering. And this is a huge burden. I mean, the United States and Britain and France have to pay for food and fuel and everything to bring to the German people to keep them from dying. And so the Germans are this huge burden on the Western Allies. And thus, they decide to move towards economic recovery without the Soviets. And the kind of western part of Germany is given a new currency, is given new economic, policies. And basically, the United States, Britain, and France begin to weld together their part of Germany to create a Western Germany. Now, as you can see here in this picture, the western part of Germany, which combines the three zones of occupation of the Americans and British and French, is quite big. And this new currency and all of these things do jumpstart the economy. But they're also in direct violation of all of the treaties signed at the end of the war. Now, this actually infuriates the Soviet Union. And in response, as you can see here, Berlin is kind of stranded right in the middle of Eastern Germany, the part controlled by the Soviets. And so in response to this move to unify Western Germany, Joseph Stalin orders that all the different routes into West Berlin, this little teeny dot in the middle of East Germany that is controlled by America, Britain, and France, he orders it to be completely closed off. No routes in or out. The thought process being that the Americans, British, and French will have to withdraw from Berlin and surrender it to the communists. And this would be a huge kind of diplomatic blow. It would be a huge symbolic blow, and Stalin would win this great kind of diplomatic triumph. Well, this leaves the United States and its allies with two choices, right? You can either withdraw and suffer humiliation, or you can invade East Germany to open up the lines back to West Berlin, provoking war, right? Neither of which are great options. So the Americans, British, and French come up with a third option. If you can't get to West Berlin by land, you get to West Berlin by air. They actually initiate what's known as the Berlin Airlift, and this actually takes place from 1948 to 1949. American and British airplanes fly in all of the food and fuel and medicine that the people of West Berlin need. Now, this is a huge triumph for the West because for two reasons, really. For one, it keeps West Berlin as part of this kind of quote-unquote free Europe. Stalin is eventually forced to back down. But even more important is it's this kind of great symbolic moment when the Americans commit to protecting the people of Western Europe from Soviet aggression. And this actually increases confidence amongst all of the Western Europeans that the Americans are there to stay and the Americans will help them, right? This also convinces the Americans of another important thing, that they need to stay in Europe to protect them, that Stalin is not going to leave these Western Europeans alone unless the Americans commit. Altogether, this leads to the United States agreeing with the major Western European powers to sign a new alliance called the North Atlantic Treaty, creating the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949. Now, NATO's back in the news. We're talking about it a lot, and you can see it's still very significant to this day. And what NATO does in 1949 is it links America's security to that of Western Europe. If the Soviets attack Western Europe, it is as if they are attacking the United States. And the United States promises to defend Western Europe with any means necessary. That includes using atomic bombs. Now you can see from this cartoon that Stalin is quite unhappy about this, but in the West this is pictured as a purely defensive alliance. This is pictured as a group of nations defending themselves from the overwhelming power of the Soviet Union. But this comfort that they get from NATO doesn't last as long as you would have liked. And that's because just a few months after the signing of the NATO treaty, Soviet scientists detonate an atomic bomb of their own. Now, this atomic bomb looks remarkably like the atomic bomb that the United States detonates. And that's because it's basically the same design. Nuclear physicists working on the American weapons program actually leaked files to Soviet spies in the hope that the fact that the Soviets would have the atomic bomb as well would mean that the Americans wouldn't ever use it again. This may have been an idealistic reason, but it's going to have pretty dramatic consequences. Now, on top of this kind of Soviet explosion of the atomic bombs, things are also not going well in other parts of the world. In 1949, the same year that all this happens, the Chinese Civil War comes to an end. And it comes to an end with the victory of communist forces. Mao Zedong announces the creation of the People's Republic of China in 1949. The most populous nation in the world is now communist. And so there's this kind of growing sense in America and in the West that the Cold War, as it's starting, is going very badly wrong. That the West is on the defensive, that communism is on the march. And this attitude, this idea is reinforced in early 1950 when in the very small peninsula of Korea, small compared to China or Japan, we have an outbreak of violence. North Korea, which is communist, invades South Korea, which was occupied by the Americans at the end of the war, and which has set up a kind of capitalist-leaning government. Now, the communists in the North wanted to reunify the country under communist control, invaded the South in 1950, believing that the United States would not commit to a ground war in Asia. But they're wrong. The United States does commit, and in fact, they involve a huge amount of resources in fighting this war. The war seesaws back and forth for the better part of 2.5 years and finally ends in a stalemate. Now, the Korean War and all of these other things have left very few people with any doubt in their mind that the future is going to be one of Cold War, that there's going to be a competition between the Soviet Union and its allies and the Americans and their allies. Now, this kind of Cold War is not just going to be a military kind of battle. It's going to be a battle between ways of life. And the key aspect of this competition, whether which system can produce the better quality of life for people, means that you need to get Europe back on its feet if you're the Americans. You need to get them back on their feet. The Marshall Plan is starting to work economic recovery, but you also need institutional recovery. If you remember, there are many moral compromises made during the war, both in Germany and other places. I mean, moral compromises is probably too soft of a word to use. There are many moral failings throughout Europe. And this leaves this very dark cloud over many of these countries at the end of the war. So it's not just recovering economically or materially, you have to recover institutionally. And this makes for some awkward questions. Because if economic recovery is so important, can you afford to imprison or kill everybody who was a Nazi or everybody who was a fascist or everybody who was a collaborator, right? Think of it this way. In Germany, to be a person of any position, you had to be a member of the Nazi Party. To be the head of the railroad or to be the guy who organizes the sewer system in Berlin or wherever, you have to be a member of the Nazi Party. Does that mean that you actually believe what the Nazis believe? Well, maybe, maybe not. Now, at the end of the war, when you need to get things going again, when you need to get things recovered, you need the railroads up and running, right? Can you afford to take this head of the railroad who may have been a Nazi and arrest him or shoot him? No, you need him to reorganize the railroads. And the same thing could be said in France, where people collaborated with the Nazi regime, or Belgium, or the Netherlands. You can't go through and just systematically cleanse everybody that's associated with the fascists. If you do, economic recovery will never take place. So this makes for some very difficult questions. And one of the ways that they settle this is by basically forgetting. You forget what happened during the war, because that raises too many awkward questions. And to kind of turn the page on the war, they hold the Nuremberg trial, which the top Nazis are tried for war crimes, and most of them either imprisoned for life or shot. This is the very, very, very top echelon of the Nazi party. Very few people actually end up getting punished, several hundred, maybe several thousand, if we include some of the other trials. Now, is this all of the Nazis? Of course not. But this big, huge, show trial that they have is able to kind of give this sense that the bad guys have been punished, we can turn the page, and everybody can forget about all the bad things we did during the war and get down to economic recovery. Now, putting the war behind them allows people to focus on the future. And one of the things that they want to focus on is they want to focus on building new institutions that will prevent the kind of economic and nationalistic competition that divided Europe in the past. This begins in 1950 and 1951, when Germany, or the western part of Germany, France and several other Western European countries sign an agreement. They signed an agreement to create something known as the European Coal and Steel Community. It doesn't sound very fancy or very exciting, but when you link together the steel and coal industries of countries, well, these are the two prime industries that you need to make weapons and that you need to make war. So if you link together these industries across your boundaries, it means that you can't build up your army or anything like that without anybody else knowing and without anybody else having a say in it. This basically links together these countries' economies and begins the process of integration that will eventually result in what we have today, the European Union. Now, the next step in this, it comes a few years later when they sign the Treaty of Rome and create something known as the European Economic Community, which is the true forefather of the European Union. Now, part of the reason that the linking of these six economies together works so well was that, like we talked about last class, they all embraced this idea of the post-war consensus, this idea of a welfare state, a government that intervenes in the economy to help out ordinary people. And together with the linking of all of these economies together, with this embrace of this new economic philosophy, all of these things come together to create one of the most amazing economic booms in history. For about 30 years after the end of the Second World War, Western Europe experiences unprecedented growth. It's sometimes called the European economic miracle. This idea that kind of by embracing Keynesian economics, by embracing the post-war consensus, by embracing integration and working together rather than competing with each other, European quality of life begins to expand and grow and get stronger. Now, this is about 4% growth year on year, and it also serves to de-radicalize politics. When you are making more and more money every single year, are you going to be interested in communism or fascism? Well, no. Everybody's life is getting better. In fact, as one commentator put it, Europeans were beginning to want goods, not gods. Now, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, we have a very different, but in some ways similar story. While the booming prosperity of Western Europe was impressive, the progress made in Eastern Europe was equally, if not more so. And that's partly because Eastern Europe was totally devastated at the end of the war. The rapid economic recovery in the East was actually, heralded as this thing that shows the superiority of communism. But the recovery and the stability that accompanied it came at the cost of political liberty. People lost their liberties, their freedoms, and their rights as communist regimes were implanted throughout Eastern Europe. Now, Eastern Europe didn't go red completely right after the war. At least for the first few years, the Soviets did keep up this fiction that they were not imposing their system. But slowly but surely, key aspects of society were seized by communists, usually the Interior Ministry, the police, the judiciary, education, and they used these tools to go after people who could potentially resist them, chiefly people who fought against the Nazis. Resistance fighters in Poland and places like that were hunted down and were murdered in an effort to prevent them from being able to lead resistance against the new communist regime. Now, once the communists had consolidated their control and their power in Eastern Europe, they began breaking down most means of organized resistance. They were able to kind of force pretty much every single aspect of civil society to come tied to the Communist Party. You couldn't have independent organizations of any sort, whether it be parent-teacher organizations or youth groups or Boy Scouts or bowling clubs or whatever. Everything had to be tied to the Communist Party. They also began to use the labor-intensive approach to industrialization embraced by the Soviets. This had, a lot of remarkable success, but came at a huge cost, just like it did in the Soviet Union. Many people died in this rushed process of recovery and industrialization. Cracking down on political opponents leads to huge amounts of prisoners and things like that. For example, in Bulgaria, there were 100,000 political slave laborers out of a workforce of about 400,000. That means 1 in 4 Bulgarian people in the 1950s were working in prison camps, right? So, when Stalin dies in the year 1953, the communist world looks powerful, looks like it's recovering, but it's recovering on a very shaky foundation of human suffering. When Stalin dies, there's this expression of grief, right? Official expression of grief. But pretty quickly, demands for reform begin to emerge, right? And this is a serious embarrassment for the communist regimes. In 1953, in Berlin, there's an uprising in East Berlin of workers who go on strike and demand better, conditions. And this is very embarrassing for communists. Communists are supposed to be the party of the workers. How could the workers possibly go on strike? And as such, they're put down with great violence by troops. Now, this does waken some of the new leaders of the Soviet Union and the other communist regimes to a potential threat. You can rule through fear and you can rule through force, but only to a point, right? You need to have some kind of legitimacy. Otherwise, you're going to be constantly putting out fires all over the place. In fact, many of the new leaders of the Soviet Union want to kind of do away with the kind of harsh dictatorship of Stalin. And what they want to do is kind of put the Soviet Union back on a legal footing, that they can govern through legal means and control through, a set process rather than kind of by the whims of a dictator. Now, a major step in this process came in 1956 when the new Soviet leader, a guy named Nikita Khrushchev, gave a secret speech to the Communist Party in which he denounces Stalin. He denounces Stalin as a criminal, as someone who has corrupted communism, and who has led the Soviet Union away from the precepts of Lenin. This begins a process known as de-Stalinization in the Soviet Union and in other places. Many of Stalin's political prisoners are released. Some of the worst abuses of the secret police force under Stalin are reformed. People are given slightly more freedom of speech and things like that. And probably the most symbolic aspect of this is they actually rebury Stalin. They move him from this kind of special place of honor and they bury him under the wall of the Kremlin under about 6 feet of concrete, probably to make sure he never got up again. Now, this kind of de-Stalinization was not meant to kind of be a signal that people could now do whatever they wanted, but it was taken as such in certain places. One of the most important of these was in Hungary, a newly communist country. The Soviet Union had taken over and implanted their allies. And in this spirit of kind of reform that comes out with Khrushchev's secret speech, young students, and then followed by workers and others in Hungary, actually rise up in rebellion. They demand that the Soviet Union withdraw its troops from Hungary and that they be allowed to hold democratic elections. Now, if the Soviet Union lets Hungary go, then what might the other Eastern European countries want? Well, they'll want something very similar. And so in November of 1956, the Red Army invades Hungary again, crushes this revolution, and reimposes hardline communists. Now, while Hungary is an example of the fact that you can't loosen your grip too much and is a blemish on the communist system, there were some amazing successes that did seem to indicate that the Soviets and the communists were making tremendous progress. Perhaps the most important of these was the launching of the first man-made satellite into outer space, the Sputnik satellite. Now, Sputnik was an amazing technological success for the Soviet Union, and it was followed up just 4 years later when the Soviets put the first man into outer space, Yuri Gagarin, in 1961. These two triumphs seem to show that the technological advancement of communism was on par, if not greater than that of the West, and it led to a lot of fear. The communists created this kind of source of pride in their technological advancement. They had done a fantastic job of rebuilding these societies that had been destroyed by the war. They had built huge industries. They had done all of these things. They had kind of reduced unemployment. And this, combined with low levels of repression and fear, caused many people to see the Eastern Europe as a superior version of civilization. But not everybody saw it that way. In fact, many people in the Eastern Bloc began to look to the West as their hope and their future. And this was particularly the case in Eastern Germany. Unlike the other communist countries, Eastern Germany had a Western counterpart. Right across the border in Western Germany, you have a capitalist Germany. Their culture is the same, the language is the same. In fact, many families live on both sides of the border. And so it became increasingly apparent to people in East Germany that if they wanted to have a better life, they needed to get to the West. And the fact that West Germany had a policy that anybody from East Germany could come and immediately become a citizen meant that many people began to actually leave. And this was particularly the case in Berlin, where literally one side of the street is West Berlin, free Berlin, and the other side of the street is East Berlin, communist Berlin. And so many people literally would just walk to West Berlin, declare themselves Western citizens, and leave communism. Now, this became increasingly desperate for East Germany. By 1961, 3.5 million people had left East Germany for the West. This is about 20% of East Germany's population. Now, many of these people were young and well educated, and that meant that these were people they couldn't afford to lose. So in August of 1961, the East German regime built a large wall all the way around West Berlin, sealing off West Berlin from the communist East Germany. Now, most of the times you build a wall to keep people out. This was a wall to keep East German citizens in so that they couldn't migrate to the capitalist West. Now, whatever the successes and failures of the two halves of Europe, this remains a competition of ways of life, but also a military confrontation. And while these economies are competing with one another, so are their militaries. The bloody stalemate that had been fought in Korea actually terrified the United States because it showed that the amount of money that would have to be invested in the military could potentially slow down the American economy and could potentially actually damage the United States' ability to compete in terms of its way of life. The new president in 1952, Dwight Eisenhower, who himself was a general, greatly feared that military spending could actually seriously hurt the American economy. Therefore, Eisenhower declared a new strategy. A strategy that would leave enough American troops in Europe to kind of slow down the Soviet Red Army, but not enough that it would cripple the American economy. Well, to make sure that the Soviet Red Army wouldn't just be able to steamroll right through the Americans and their allies, Eisenhower made it known that any Soviet attack on Western Europe would be met with what he called massive retaliation. In essence, the Americans would launch a full nuclear strike against the Soviet Union with all of their nuclear weapons if the Red Army invaded. Now, this is a pretty devastating threat and a pretty dangerous situation, but it also is not a very flexible strategy. So in the early 1960s, the Americans changed this strategy a little bit. But still, the basic premise of their defensive policy is that if the Soviets start a war, it will become a nuclear war. Now, initially, this is not as dangerous as it sounds. The Soviets have nuclear weapons, but they don't really have very reliable ways of delivering them to the United States. The Americans could potentially hit the Soviet Union with little fear of being attacked in return. And also, when bombs are your primary form of nuclear device, you can launch your airplanes into the air and you have hours, 6, 7, 8 hours to decide whether to actually drop these nuclear bombs. So there is a little bit of flexibility, right? Well, unfortunately, things are about to change. And things are about to change because these same rockets that put things like Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin into outer space, and later the American astronauts into outer space, these same rockets can be tipped with nuclear weapons, turning them into intercontinental ballistic missiles. Missiles change the calculation of warfare because, unlike a bomber, which you can call back, even after it's in the air, say, don't launch your bombs, just come back. When you press the button and launch an ICBM, there is no going back. It's going to hit the Soviet Union or hit the United States in about 25 to 30 minutes. Now, at first, these intercontinental ballistic missiles in the late 50s and early 1960s are not terribly accurate, right? You could fire a missile from the Soviet Union aiming it at Washington, D.C. and end up landing it in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, right? So there is a little bit of, not as much fear as there could have been. But short-range missiles and medium-range missiles are very accurate. The United States has a bunch of these in Turkey, in Italy, and in other allies that they can pretty much be guaranteed to wipe out the Soviet Union in the event of a war, while still being relatively sure that American cities would be safe. Now, wouldn't it be nice for the Soviets if they could find an island about 90 miles off the coast of Florida, which they could put their nuclear missiles on and be guaranteed to be able to hit America's cities? Well, it just so happens that that island exists, and it's called Cuba. When Cuba has a revolution in 1959, it leads to Fidel Castro coming to power. Castro was initially not a communist. He was a left-wing, politician, but not a communist. But when the United States tried to overthrow him in 1961, he turned to the Soviets for help. And he allowed the Soviets to build nuclear weapons bases on his island. These short and medium-range missiles would be able to hit cities like Washington, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, so on and so forth. Now, this is a huge threat to the United States, not just because this increases the danger of nuclear war, but because this could potentially break up NATO. If the NATO allies don't believe that the United States will use their nuclear weapons to defend them, they might actually seek neutrality or might seek some accommodation with the Soviet Union. So the U.S. President, John F. Kennedy, realizes that this threat of missiles in Cuba, the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis, is a profound threat to the United States and to the alliance. And so he orders his Navy to quarantine the island of Cuba. Now, this is technically an act of war. Stopping ships coming to Cuba that have these nuclear weapons on them from the Soviet Union is an act of war. But through kind of diplomatic language, manipulation, they're able to keep up this fiction that they're quarantining rather than blockading the island. Now, this increases tensions tremendously between the Soviet Union and the United States, and for about 13 days in October of 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world is on the verge of nuclear war. In fact, we now know that a nuclear submarine, a Soviet nuclear submarine with nuclear-armed torpedoes, was actually cornered by U.S. Navy vessels during this crisis, and the commander of the submarine wanted to launch his nuclear torpedoes to destroy the U.S. Navy. Now, like on our submarines, a commander cannot launch nuclear weapons without the approval of his first mate, the second in command of the ship. And in this case, the second in command of the ship refused to fire the missiles. Now, if this guy had agreed with his captain, the American fleet would have been destroyed by nuclear weapons, and this would have launched a full-scale nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union, and none of us would be here. We would all be incinerated piles of ash. Now, the crisis is eventually resolved diplomatically, but it is terrifying to both the United States and the Soviet Union how close we could potentially come to nuclear war. This changes the calculus because this crisis causes both sides to realize that they now exist in a state known as mutually assured destruction. Any war between the United States and the Soviet Union will most likely, if not inevitably, result in the complete and total annihilation of both countries. I mean, if you think about it, even just a few of these nuclear weapons being dropped on cities like Moscow and Washington and New York, I mean, even that would be enough to consider that both sides would have lost. When you add in the fact that these nuclear weapons throw radiation into the air that will kill crops and animals and people all over the place, we're talking about the end of human civilization. This is a terrifying reality, and both of these countries become armed with thousands and thousands and thousands of these weapons. At their peak, each side have about 25,000 warheads. This is way more than enough to kill every single living being and person and animal on the face of the earth thousands of times over. But in an ironic sense, it also means that the United States and the Soviet Union are very unlikely to go to war with one another. This kind of terrible, terrible, terrible reality prevents them from actually fighting one another. It keeps the Cold War cold. At least in Europe and in the Northern Hemisphere. If the Soviet Union and the United States can't fight each other directly, they're going to find other places to fight one another indirectly. Mutually assured destruction is going to mean that the United States and the Soviet Union don't fight each other, face to face. But what it does mean is that the global South, Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, these places that are going to be emerging into independence in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s are going to be the battleground in which the United States and the Soviet Union are going to fight. They will not fight directly, but their proxies and their allies in the third world, as it comes to be known, will be fighting each other tooth and nail. And as we're going to see, the Cold War is not so cold in the South. The Cold War is actually going to result in brutal fighting throughout the third world that's going to result in the death of millions of people, just not people who are from Europe. So we'll talk about that in the next lecture, and I guess I won't see you. I guess I'll talk to you then.